Good morning. My name is Robert Hull. I'm one of the cardiology fellows at Brooke Army Medical Center. I'd like to thank SURF on behalf of myself and my co-authors for this opportunity to present an exciting project we've been able to work on at BAMC, in which we've been able to amass a comprehensive high-fidelity hemodynamic waveform database that I look forward to reviewing today. As a disclaimer, these are the views of myself and my co-authors and not of the Department of Defense, the United States government, or any of its branches. To orient us to our discussion today, first we'll review what is involved in an invasive hemodynamic assessment. We'll talk about why we perform it. We'll talk about the critical pressure transduction that's required to perform it. We'll discuss Brooke Army Medical Center's unique role in high-fidelity waveforms. We'll review some representative cases from our database, and then we'll conclude. So I know we have a varied audience, and to many in the audience, cardiac catheterization and invasive hemodynamic assessments will likely be routine. And potentially for some in the audience, this will be the first time discussing it in depth. But one of the powerful tools we have in clinical cardiology is the cardiac catheterization, commonly referred to as a right or left heart catheterization, depending on the cardiac chambers under study. For a right heart catheterization, we first obtain venous vascular access, most commonly through the internal jugular or femoral vein. And then sequentially in antegrade fashion, we advance a catheter through the right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary artery, and ultimately with a balloon tip flotation catheter, wedge in the distal pulmonary artery, creating a static fluid column whose pressure we measure as a surrogate of left atrial pressure. Alternatively, we can perform a left heart catheterization, and for this procedure we obtain arterial vascular access. Currently, that's most commonly done through the radial or femoral arteries, although the majority of these studies were performed via a brachial approach. And we advance a catheter retrograde into the aorta and then the left ventricle and perform our hemodynamic measurements. On the right of the screen, we have some representative high-fidelity tracings to review. These pressure tracings are taken with live electrocardiographic monitoring, which we can use to reference these waveforms to electrical systole or diastole. Here we have a pulmonary arterial tracing, a right ventricular tracing, a right atrial tracing, an arterial or aortic tracing, which is very similar to the pulmonary artery tracing, although you'll notice of higher magnitude and pressure, and a left ventricular tracing, again similar to the right ventricular tracing, although higher pressure. And then, as means of comparison, you can see here a high-fidelity pulmonary arterial pressure tracing compared to a noisier, more artifact-filled, fluid-filled catheter tracing of a pulmonary arterial pressure. So we've reviewed what's involved with an invasive hemodynamic assessment. Why do we perform it? We perform it in some disease states because we know that it can improve our management, such as cardiogenic shock. And then it's a powerful diagnostic tool in others, for example, an undifferentiated shock with indeterminate volume status, with cardiomyopathy, pulmonary hypertension, intracardiac shunt, pericardial disease. It's often performed routinely in the post-heart transplant setting, and to this day remains a gold standard tiebreaker when we have a discordant clinical impression from the results of our non-invasive testing. So now that we've reviewed how and why we perform hemodynamic assessments, let's review the critical component of pressure transduction to an electrical signal. For cost reasons in current clinical practice, this is most commonly performed with a fluid-filled catheter system, in which a hollow plastic catheter into which saline has been infused to create a continuous fluid column is placed in the cardiac chamber which is desired to be studied, and a pressure wave is transmitted through the fluid to a pressure transducer located outside of the patient and by historical standard reference to the right atrium. It's beneficial in terms of cost, but unfortunately it can have clinically relevant artifacts such as damping, in which the extremes of pressure change are underrepresented or muted, a time or phase delay, which can be relevant given the important cardiac events in a cardiac cycle occur in the order of milliseconds, and does have to be referenced to account for positional hydrostatic pressure differences. A more expensive, although technically superior option is a multi-sensor micromanometer, in which the pressure transducer is at the tip of the catheter itself, and when an electromagnetic sensor is available, you can perform simultaneous velocity measurements as well. Although these studies are still performed with a fluid-filled catheter to allow correction for hydrostatic pressure differences between the pressure transduced in the cardiac chamber and the historical standard of the patient's right atrium. In complements of our cath lab, here's an example of a fluid-filled catheter system often used today. Here's a Swan-Ganz or pulmonary arterial catheter. You can see that it is connected to some non-compliant high-pressure tubing, which connects to a pressure manifold, and then through additional tubing to a pressure transducer located outside of the patient's body and meticulously referenced to the right atrium. Here we have a Wheatstone bridge or a strain gauge, in which there's a diaphragm that, as it is deformed with pressure waves that collide with it, it causes stretching of an electrical wire, which changes resistance and therefore voltage output, which we then can amplify and display. And here is a hi-fi micromanometer catheter, in which you can see the pressure transducers at the tip of the catheter, and just showing the several varieties available. Here's a single, double, and triple tip catheter. Some had flow sensors, some had phonocardiographic sensors, but they could allow high fidelity and potentially simultaneous cardiac chamber waveform measurement. These catheters also had a superior frequency response curve, in addition to decreased artifact that make them, from a quality standpoint, desirable. So that brings us to BAMC's unique role with high-fidelity waveforms. From the early 70s to early 90s, these high-fidelity catheters were routinely used as part of the invasive hemodynamic assessment of patients. We have a database of the hemodynamic data of over 4,000 patients. It includes waveforms, procedural voice narration, and the potential for derived intracardiac phonocardiograms. And these are all recorded on analog tape, which have subsequently been digitized. A third of these patients have flow velocities available, and we have a vast, comprehensive database of additional clinical findings that we can index to these hemodynamic cases to correlate the clinical and hemodynamic findings. And through really a superhuman effort by Mr. Bulgrim and Dr. Rubel, we've been able to complete approximately 600 tapes. We've been able to digitize over 2 million feet of tape, and we now have available over 100,000 hours of cases. And on the right, you can see that we have a varied and comprehensive database. It includes classic cardiovascular pathology and their representative hemodynamic tracing. So, for example, atherosclerotic heart disease, valvular heart disease, congenital heart disease, various cardiomyopathies, pulmonary hypertension, pericardial disease, and post-transplant patients. And thanks to Guy Drew, we have custom-designed software that allows full disclosure with voice channel and event markers, real-time and faster than real-time playback. You can post-process on a beat-by-beat basis and adjust gain and the time compression or sweep speed, and derive intracardiac phonograms. So now I've reviewed how our library was created, what's available. Let's show some representative cases. For this first case, I'll be showing you a patient performing a Valsalva maneuver. You'll see phase 1 with strain initiation as expiratory pressure increase is transmitted to the great vessels, and you'll have an increase in aortic pressure. During phase 2, in the early prolonged strain, you'll see a decrease in aortic pressure as venous return is impeded and left ventricular stroke volume falls. Then with late prolonged strain, you'll see an increase in heart rate and aortic blood pressure as a result of increasing sympathetic tone and a withdrawal of vagal tone. With release in phase 3, you'll see the decrease in intrathoracic pressure result in a decrease in aortic pressure. And during phase 4 overshoot, you'll see as you have restoration of venous return to a left ventricle that's in an increased contractile state and a peripherally vasoconstricted state as a result of the increased sympathetic tone, you'll see a dramatic rise in aortic pressure with subsequent withdrawal of sympathetic tone and increased vagal tone. I'll now play this video for you, and just as a means of orienting you to it, in white you'll have a left ventricular, in red an aortic, in light blue a pulmonary arterial, and in purple a right atrial high fidelity tracing, and in yellow a fluid-filled catheter pulmonary arterial tracing. Phase 1. Early phase 2. Late phase 2. Phase 3. And phase 4 overshoot. And now the same video with a compressed time scale to show the benefit of a different perspective for appreciating trends.
The next one, 2471. This is control for the
phase 1. Early phase 2.
Valsalva maneuvers in progress now as rate is 80.
Late phase 2.
Rate is increasing. He's released it.
Phase 3. And phase 4 overshoot. And as an example of the comprehensive clinical data that's available for these cases, we have the history of present illness, past medical history, exam at a time when much more attention was paid to the physical exam, the electrocardiographic and non-invasive testing results, as well as the results of their coronary angiography, which was often performed simultaneously. We have the primary hemodynamic data available, and for example, with this patient, we have the result of the left ventriculography determined ejection fraction, as well as the ultimate conclusions and diagnoses. This patient, for example, had a large secundum atrioseptal defect with significant left to right shunting. And here are the high fidelity waveforms from that patient we just reviewed, which, for example, can demonstrate classic hemodynamic findings such as equalization of right and left atrial pressures in the setting of a significant atrial septal defect. We have here in red a high-fidelity transeptal left atrial pressure waveform, and in gray a right atrial pressure waveform, which you can appreciate are equalized. And for example, the reason for the commonly cited, clinically auscultated, fixed split S2. We have patients with both acquired and congenital valvular heart disease. Here's a patient with pulmonic stenosis. You can appreciate on this pink waveform an elevated right ventricular systolic pressure, and on the pulmonary arterial waveform a delayed upstroke to a damped, decreased pulmonary arterial pressure, representative of the tarvis et partis aspects of the waveform, respectively, as well as the significant right ventricular to pulmonary arterial gradient. Here's an example of a patient with critical aortic stenosis. We have a left ventricular tracing, an aortic tracing. We have some respirophasic change in the aortic pressures, but you can see that following a premature ventricular contraction, there is a compensatory pause with an increase in the gradient, but without a decrease in the pulse pressure, which would have been characteristic of dynamic obstruction. So again, this is diagnostic of fixed obstruction, characteristic of a critical aortic stenosis. On the right, we have supravalvular aortic stenosis. Here you can see with the double-tipped high-fidelity catheter, you have a significant gradient confined to systole, then with preservation of the dicrotic notch and diastolic runoff consistent with a supravalvular aortic stenosis, with simultaneously obtained aortic outflow velocities. Here's a patient with severe mitral stenosis, left ventricular tracing in purple, pulmonary arterial tracing in red, and a fluid-filled pulmonary capillary wedge tracing in white, in which you can appreciate a large V wave with a diastolic gradient and a preserved end diastolic gradient, characteristic of severe mitral stenosis. We also have pericardial diseases. Here's a patient with constrictive pericarditis who beautifully demonstrates equalization of end diastolic pressures, as well as the square root sign, in which you have rapid cessation of early ventricular filling with then a exaggerated rise in the ventricular diastolic filling pressures. You could compress the time scale and compare discordant ventricular changes between the right and left ventricles, characteristic of ventricular interdependence, another classic hemodynamic hallmark of this disease. And we have bilateral flow velocities also available for this study. Our database also has various pharmacologic challenges. As an example, on the left, you can see in a patient with dilated cardiomyopathy, high-fidelity left ventricular waveforms with an elevated left ventricular end diastolic pressure and a transeptal fluid-filled catheter tracing that shows a giant V wave and elevated left atrial pressures, which after administration of nitroprusside, a venous and arterial vasodilator, you can appreciate that these filling pressures were dramatically decreased. On the right, you can see a patient with severe mitral stenosis who received amyl nitrite, which is an arterial vasodilator. And you can see in blue for the left ventricle and in green for the aortic pressures, you can see a fall in these pressures with the arterial dilation. And then with discontinuation of the drug, you can appreciate that there's recovery of these pressures. Our database has exercise studies that was routinely performed as part of the invasive hemodynamic assessment protocol. On the left, you can see a normal patient with normal flow-mediated increase in pressures. And on the right, you can see a patient with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with a resting dynamic obstruction in late systole with a characteristic spike and dome pattern of the aortic waveform, whom, after exercise, had worsening dynamic obstruction and an increased left ventricular to aortic gradient, as well as the unmasking of a right outflow tract gradient. So in conclusion, the cardiology division at BAMC has created the world's largest known high-fidelity hemodynamic waveform repository. And it has vast potential, educational potential for graduate and continuing medical education, cardiovascular disease modeling potential, and potential for the development and validation of the next generation of critical care monitoring systems. And it's all due to the pioneering work of Colonel Retired Dr. Joseph Murgo, who started this initiative many decades ago. I'd like to say thank you to my co-authors for allowing me to be involved with this project. I'd like to say thank you to the BAMC Cath Lab staff, both present and prior. And again, would like to say thank you to SURF for allowing us a forum to discuss this exciting project. Here are our references, and thank you all for your time.